focused on forage, optimizing alternative forage production in Wisconsin. This webinar series is sponsored by the University of Wisconsin Division of Extension and the UW Nutrient and Pest Management Program. I am Michael Geisinger, a regional outreach specialist for the Nutrient and Pest Management Program with UW-Madison, and I will be your webinar moderator today. So, many of you are familiar with our virtual presentations in the Zoom platform, I'm going to go through a few housekeeping items. Please be sure to keep your microphones muted and videos off during the webinar to preserve bandwidth. The mute and video controls are located on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. Also, please feel free to type questions for our presenters into the chat box at any time. The chat button is located in the bottom center of your screen. We'll answer as many questions as we can as time allows as the presenters are going. We are offering one CCA CEU credit for today's webinar. We will have a link for a form at the end of the presentations that will have the QR code for you to scan, or you can enter your name and certification number into the chat. We will submit all information by the end of the week to the American Society of Agronomy. If you have any questions or difficulties with Zoom technology today, you can type your question into the chat or alternatively email Jerry Clark. Jerry's email is jerome.clark@wisc.edu and will be posted in the chat. If you're having difficulties with your audio, the call-in information will also be provided in the chat. And without any further ado, we'll have Bill start pulling up his slides. With that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Bill Halfman, Beef Outreach Specialist for UW-Madison's Division of Extension, who will be discussing beef utilization of alternative forages. Go ahead, Bill.
Thank you and good afternoon, everybody. So I'm in this new role with Extension as the Beef Outreach Specialist. Some of you may remember me as the Monroe County Ag Agent for many years. Early in my extension career, I actually worked in Tennessee with a lot of beef production and forages. And so we'll just kind of make our way through this discussion here. And some of the things I think that it's a good idea to think about when evaluating or looking at using some alternative forages in beef production system is the first thing we want to do is evaluate our current forage resources. And if we look at things, and Jason's going to talk about this in greater detail, but I'll just say that, kind of our perennial pastures are going to be our lowest cost sources of feed for the cattle. And so we can look at those and see where we have some opportunities, where we have some needs for additional forage production, looking at maybe what time of the year, can we extend the grazing season, looking at what category of animals we want to feed. Are they growing animals that need a higher nutritional value? Are they cows with calves that are nursing on them that may need some higher nutritional value? Or are they dry cows that have pretty low nutritional needs? And how can we meet those? Again, and ideally we want to look at being able to do that as economically as possible to help fill those needs. And the other question that we may have as we look at some of these annuals, which I'm going to spend most of the time discussing today, is how do they fit in with our rotation? Maybe you're the situation where folks are adapting some cover crops and they're looking at those and wondering, can we get some forages off of those to help supplement a beef enterprise on the farm? So if we kind of look at our forage resources and extending the grazing season or potentially some additional feed needs that we have, we can kind of look at it from a filling in the gap standpoint. So if you look at the calendar here, the top row, the green row, that's going to be our cool season perennial mixtures, our pastures, potentially some of our hayfields / pastures. And when do we get the most growth out of those, the most availability as pasture for grazing? And usually that's, depending on where you're at in Wisconsin, it could be late April, and we usually get pretty good growth out of those through early July. Most of the time in Wisconsin with our cool season plants, we will see a decline in production during the hot time in the summertime. So there may be an opportunity for some other things there to supplement some grazing, and then we'll see a fall increase again. And if we manage those correctly, we may have the opportunity on our farm with the resources that we have to stockpile some of those and graze on those actually after they go dormant. Another common thing that's utilized during that fall time is putting the cows out on the corn stalks after the calves are weaned for a while to help cut down on feed costs. So if we look at our next line, we've got the opportunity maybe for incorporating some winter annuals. And so those would be typically seeded sometime in August through potentially early October, depending on the crop rotation again and what we want to do with it. If we can get those seeded early enough, we could get some fall grazing off of them. If not, we could potentially get some spring grazing off of those. Another crop that may fit in as an alternative annual type forage would be using oats in the fall. And again, those we'd be looking at seeding those in later July into August, and then using those potentially out in that October, November timeframe, depending on the year. And then another one that may fit would be our summer annuals. And we'll talk more about all of these categories here a little bit. But those we typically would be looking at planting in late May and June, and then have something to graze on those, depending on how early we get them planted, somewhere in that later July. The lion's share of the growth is going to be in that from planting through towards the end of August. As things start to cool down in September, their growth is gonna taper off a lot. But if we have some stockpile of that could be extended out farther into the fall. So, one of the ways we look at it is, as I mentioned earlier, look what we have. Look where the gaps are. What could we use to fill in those gaps to kind of extend our season? So if we want to spend a little time here talking about the winter cereal grains in our part of the country, it seems like rye is probably the most commonly used one. And we could also use winter wheat or winter triticale. And if we look at those three, rye is typically going to grow under cooler weather than the wheat will. It's going to green up sooner. And generally have greater yield. Now there are some winter triticale varieties that are starting to show up that have some yield that will compete pretty favorably with rye. But typically the rye is going to be the toughest one that we have, the most hardy, and so that's the one we see most commonly used. And the other thing too is when we look at prices, that's probably going to be the most inexpensive seed to be able to get a hold of too. If we look at those three winter cereal grains, we can probably expect yield somewhere in that 2 to 3 tons of dry matter per acre basis, depending on the year. And if we're looking at it from a quality standpoint, that in that boot stage, it's typically going to be somewhere around 15% protein. But prior to going into reproductive stage, it's actually very higher quality than that, and works really well. And in some parts of the country, most folks are probably familiar, they actually graze stocker calves on it and get really good growth out of the small grain cereals. So some general management. If we get it planted early, looking at the tail end of August or mid-August, we may be able to graze it 1 or 2 times in the fall with favorable weather. When you're doing that though, in the fall grazing, you want to only have the animals out there long enough to remove about half the leaf and leave half the leaf. If we're looking at incorporating that as a rotation and kind of serving the double crop purpose with it, where it would be grazed, but maybe also kind of get some cover crop properties out of it too. Following corn silage or soybeans, it may not get enough growth some years for fall grazing. Some of the research that they did in Iowa recently, they indicated that they said, yeah, you can, they've seen getting up to 3 to 4 weeks of grazing off of it in ideal weather, but other years with harvest being delayed and weather being poor, they were not able to get any fall grazing off of it at all. So it's kind of one of those things. If you're using it in that regard, you can kind of look at it as a bonus rather than a guarantee. The other thing that the small grains do, I think, that can be very beneficial to beef production is they may serve as an area that we can use as a Nebraska sandhills calving system type setup. And if you're not familiar with that, ideally we want those cows not to be calving where they were overwintered. So we have a clean area for them to calve. And so if we've got some winter small grains that are greening up in the spring, what you do is you move the cows that are all expecting into this new area, and then roughly every week, everybody that has not calved goes to a new pasture, and the ones that have calved stay there. So all the new babies within a week are born into a cleaner pasture. And I do know some producers that are using the small grains in that manner to help with their calving system and helping provide that clean place for those babies to be born and get off to a good start. Did talk a little bit about quality in the earlier slide, but this is a good graph that kind of shows us one of the challenges with small grains is when they go from the vegetative stages into the reproductive stages, the quality on those from an animal quality, of forage quality standpoint, declines really fast. And so, if we look at right around boot stage and we see that relative feed quality is very good for growing animals, high quality, but roughly 2 weeks later, it's down to quite a bit lower quality materials that's probably better suited for cows that were kind of overwintering. And so that's important to remember that if you're using that, once it hits those reproduction stages of growth, the quality does decline very fast, going from pretty good feed down to something that might be closer suited to bedding. Switching gears here a little bit, talk about summer annuals. Kind of our main summer annuals that we would potentially be looking at would be some of the sorghum, Sudan grass crosses, the forage sorghums, or the Sudan grasses, and then the millets. And with these warm season annuals, heat and moisture really does drive yield on those quite a bit. Some other potential summer annuals could be teff grass, which is a very fine stem grass. I know some producers have used a little bit. It does seem to tolerate drier conditions better than some of the other species. And there's also been some initial work done with crabgrass up in Wisconsin here a little bit. I don't know that we have just a tremendous amount of research and data on that yet, but there is some work going on looking at those as a possible warm season annual type forage as well. That those would be definitely better suited for grazing than trying to make hay or haylage off of those. This is some recent work that was done at Iowa State and Northeast Iowa, looking at, this would be the pearl millets, the sorghum Sudan grasses, and the Sudan grasses. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the nitrogen treatments on here. John's going to talk about that kind of stuff here later on. But what I would want to show here is they looked at these and they harvested them with a 2-cut system and a 1-cut system just to get an idea on yield. So if you look at the graph here, you can see that this is the first cutting of the 2-cut system, and it was harvested roughly 60 days after it was planted. And you can see on the millets, you get somewhere between 1 to 1.5 tons, depending on the year and the variety. The sorghum Sudan grasses were somewhere between 2 and 3 tons, and the Sudan grass was also in around that 2-ton in that first cutting. Then they've got the Japanese millet at the bottom there, which was 1 ton. And you look at the quality on those, that's pretty good quality as far as protein and TDN on those. That's some pretty nice feed right there. And then if we look at the second cutting that was done on those, so this would be 30 days after the first cutting. Okay, so they went in there and cut, and then 30 days later they cut again. You can see there was pretty good yields, some in that 2 to 3 ton range. But the quality on it was lower than the first cutting was, even though it was only 30 days later. And so that's what we're seeing on those, you know, and it varies from year to year, as you can see there, and from variety to variety. And a lot of that's going to be very much weather related. Now this is the single cut. So this was harvested 90 days one time after planting. And you can see there that, you know, we're looking at somewhere between 2.5 to little over 3 tons on the millets at the top. Same with the millet at the bottom. And then the sorghum Sudan grass crosses were somewhere between 5.5 and 7.5 tons. And then the hybrid Sudan grass there was some variability there, somewhere between 2.5 and 4.5 tons. And but look at the quality on this. This was actually quite a bit lower even again than the second cutting of the 2-cut system. So the animals that would have to eat this material probably would need some supplemental protein, depending on the category of animal that we're looking at. Most animals, even beef animals, may require some additional protein with some of those forages as their primary ration. And this slide, basically what it does is it compares the total yields of the double harvest to the single harvest. And again, you can see there was some advantages in some cases for 2 harvests versus a single. Certainly there was quality advantages to the 2 cutting system. And in other cases, there wasn't so much difference. And it's kind of a mixed bag on the results there over this 2 years worth of looking at these numbers. But it gives us an idea of what we can expect for yield from these summer annuals if we utilize those in our farm operation to provide some feed to the beef cattle. If we are going to graze those, and they certainly can be grazed, and when I was down in Tennessee, a lot of folks that were doing stocker cattle would use summer annuals to graze and keep them in a vegetative state to keep that quality up there and get very nice gains off of the stocker calves in the summertime. But you definitely want to manage the grazing. You definitely want to limit, kind of make them eat it down with a kind of a drift fence type system, or set it up with rotational grazing paddocks and have them eat it off. And it can tolerate, when you do graze it, sometimes it seems like it works better to put a higher number in there for a shorter duration and have them eat it down and then give it a rest. And one of the important things, though, with these plants, the sorghum Sudan grasses and the millets, is you don't want to graze them too short. You want to graze them down. The sorghum Sudan grasses and Sudan grasses, you want to graze or mow those, if you're going to mow them for hay, down somewhere in that 6 to 8 inch range. Part of the reason for that is that's where the nodes are, where the regrowth is going to come up. And the other part is under stress situations, some of those lower portions of the plant could potentially have high enough prussic acid in those on stress times to potentially cause some problems, even during the growing season. Millets, we want to graze those actually a little bit different height range, and I've got those kind of recommended ranges here coming up shortly. So one of the other challenges, if you do want to harvest those for forage mechanically, the sorghum Sudan grass and the millet, they can be quite difficult to get dry. They've got several of those have a thicker stem that's going to be more difficult to get dry, and it may work better to chop it and shove it in a bag or something like that. It can be baled, but again, it's trickier, just like any of the other crops that have that big stem. When you plant those, ideally the sorghums and the Sudan grasses, you want to wait until they're at least 18 inches tall and then graze them down to about 8 inches tall. And ideally we would like to not see them really get bigger than 30 inches tall before animals go in there. And then once they get quite a bit big, once they get over 30 inches tall, the quality starts going down quite a bit on them too. With the millets, it's a little bit different. You want to put the animals in there when they're somewhere in that 20 to 24 inches tall. So roughly 6 inches taller than the sorghum Sudan grasses. They're not going to get as tall in general as the sorghum Sudan grasses and the millets do. And then when you graze them, you want to keep those a little bit taller, somewhere in that 9 to 12 inches stubble height on those. And both of those with the rotational system and good weather, they can actually be ready to graze again back to that height in about 20 to 25 days, with cooperative weather. We get cool weather, and of course that's going to slow things down with those. A couple words here too on prussic acid and some nitrate concerns. For one, millets themselves, they do not produce prussic acid. So when we have a frost situation or some other stresses, that's not a concern with the millets. And what we actually saw, a lot of folks that were doing the summer annuals in other places, they would have some millets and some sorghum Sudan grasses in different areas. And so when it was run into situations where there was risk of prussic acid, like frost or other stress, they would have the animals over in the millet, maybe for a little while longer than they would otherwise, and then go back into the others when it was safe. So if we do have a frost situation with the sorghum Sudan grass type crops, you want to keep them out of there for 7 to 14 days to let that prussic acid dissipate out. And it's in all the parts throughout the plant. It's a little different than the nitrates as far as where they're mostly concentrated down in the lower parts of the stem during drought situations. The prussic acid will be there when freeze happens, no matter what the weather has been prior to that. And it will be throughout the plant. So that's important to remember, to keep them out of there. You can ensile it, and if you leave the ensiling process, somewhere between 4 and 8 weeks will cause the prussic acid to drop down to safe levels. And then the drying procedure that the plant goes through also helps to reduce those levels, but it's always a good idea if you have harvested those during what might be considered riskier times to test the forages before you feed them. And it's always a good idea to test anyway, so you can balance your rations and spend your money accordingly if you have to for any supplemental needs. They can also have nitrate problems similar to corn, where we get into dry situations, or or in a combination with higher nitrogen levels. We may see some concerns there. And again, that's going to be more in the lower portions of the plant, but they are also subject to that particular risk too in those situations. Another crop that I had on the chart there for filling in gaps is late oats, and they're a very different plant than spring oats. Ideally, for getting decent yield out of those, we'd like to see those planted somewhere by mid-August, so they've got enough time to grow. And you want to select the later maturing oats to do this. You're going to get a higher yield than some of the short maturing ones. No, they're not going to survive the winter, and that could be both good and bad. You don't have to worry about terminating in the winter, but you don't have maybe as much residue there from a soil erosion control standpoint. And so again, as I mentioned, you want those mid or later maturing oats to maximize yield when you're planting it in those. This can be grazed or harvested, and it makes some really high quality feed that might be really good for putting those calves out on after weaning and putting some pounds on them, or harvesting it and using that forage when the cows get closer to calving and after calving. If you just let the cows go out in there and eat on the late planted oats after they're weaning the calves off, that's going to exceed their nutrient requirements. That they'll get fat and sassy on you with that kind of forage, unless you're limiting them to so much a day and then letting them fill their bellies up on some other things to keep them feeling full and happy. One thing I do want to mention that is very important when we're looking at using some of these crops in rotation with some of our other crops that may be grown on the farm, it is important that we look at any pesticide restrictions that may exist. So it's very important to look at the herbicide labels that were used on the previous crop because they do have planting restrictions on the follow-up crops regarding use as a forage. And some of the herbicides may eliminate the use of those crops that you may plant as a cover crop from use as a forage. And the same thing with if we're going to use any crop residues and we happen to use any sort of fungicide on the previous crop and maybe want to use on like a corn crop, and maybe we want to use the corn stalks to feed the cattle, we need to look at those labels and see what kind of restrictions there are on those, because some of them do not allow for those kinds of things. So it's very important to check labels. And it's always important to look at them somewhat regular, because sometimes they do change over time. And it's important to remember that the label is the law, and we don't need to be getting residues from pesticides in where they don't need to be. Corn stover is another, grazing corn stalks. I see some folks do this pretty regular, where they've got fences around the cornfields and calves are weaned and the cows go out on corn stalks and they go through and find any ears that dropped and eat the leaves and the husks. Primarily, they like those the best, and the smaller ends of the stems, and then work their way down and eat the less desirable stuff later. If they're out there grazing, feeding on those corn stalks, and maybe we get a month or 6 weeks or whatever out of those, most of the nutrients that they might be eating out of the stalks, they're pretty much recycling and leaving right back on there as they walk around. If anybody would be interested in potentially renting some cornfields to put their cattle out on for a while for grazing, Nebraska's got a nice tool to help kind of come up with a reasonable rental rate. You do want to be careful though, when grazing corn stover, to look for if there happened to be a place where the combine spilled a big pile, or there's a whole bunch of high rate of drop ears because of insect pressure or stalk rot or something like that. That actually could potentially cause some problems if some of the cows found those and ate way too much of that corn to start with. It could cause some acidosis problems for those animals, and so we do need to be cautious about that. Most cornfields, that's probably not going to be a concern. It would be an occasional incident, more likely, but it is worth keeping in mind that is a risk if some of those kinds of things did happen. So I think, in general, as I mentioned earlier, take a look at what we have for our forage base, and then look at where we could have some opportunities to extend the grazing season or fill in some gaps that we have, and see if some of these types of crops may be something that fits well in them. Be careful when you're looking at seeds. I know we can find, a lot of mixes and blends and things like that, but some of those, when you look at the price per acre, are quite expensive. And I think we can probably do just as well with some of the more basic type of crops out there with some of these annuals to help fill in some gaps and extend some of our grazing for beef cow operations. And so we've got some websites here where you can find more information if you want to. Our livestock website is listed there, as well as the crops and soils one. And then there is a new, it was the old beef Facebook page, has a new name now. And then new things are starting to be put on it again, called the Wisconsin Livestock Extension is our new Facebook page. And I want to also recognize some of the pieces and parts of this presentation were pulled from some materials that some of us in that West Central area had put together a few years ago to help educate some folks when we had some forage shortages. And so some of this material is things that they had helped prepare as well. So with that, I would thank you for your attention and turn it back to Michael.
All right, thank you very much, Bill. We have time for a few questions. I think there was one in the chat from Brian. Are there any issues grazing sorghum or sorghum Sudan with animals trampling plants and damaging the growing point?
Typically not. There could be an occasional problem with that, but my understanding is most of the time that's not a big deal. As long as you're kind of getting them in there, having them eat it down to that 8-10 inch height range and then moving them out of there and leaving those plants alone. If you don't get them out of there and you just kind of let them wander around wherever they want, there definitely would be some more damage to those plants. So well managed shouldn't be an issue.
Thanks. Are there any other questions? Feel free to unmute and just ask your question, or you can send it into the chat. Another question from Brian. Has there been any work grazing cover crop legumes such as hairy vetch, field peas, cow peas, sun hemp, etc.?
I'm not aware of a lot of work done with those. There may be some, but I'm not aware of a lot of it if there is.
Last chance for any questions before we start moving on for Bill. If we have time at the end of the webinar, we can always come back to additional questions for any of our presenters to address as appropriate. But at that, I'd like to thank you, Bill, again for joining us on providing your time and expertise. And I will invite John at this time to start getting ready to share his slides. So we'll be hearing from John Jones. John is a researcher and lecturer from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he'll be discussing nitrogen decisions for alternative forages. John, whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Great, thanks, Michael. Welcome everyone today. Hopefully everyone's enjoying a balmy afternoon in Wisconsin relative to what we've had in the last few weeks. I'm sure we'll get snow at the end of the week, like every week this last month had been like. My topic today is nitrogen decisions for alternative forages. Really, I'll be covering some results of two separate projects, but have a lot of common collaborators, many that are on this call, and we'll go through a few slides at the end of the presentation, thanking them for all the work on this. So really this is designed to go through the results of two projects, some data showing how alternative forages in terms of not just tonnage and yield, but crop forage quality respond to nitrogen rates specifically, and then also what are some of the economic implications of some N rates that we may apply and may work well in your own operations. So again, the goals are really we'll talk about the end demand of some of these alternative forages. That maybe the most unclear topic, because we do have such a range of mixes and species that we can plant, and it's hard to bin those all into a recommended nitrogen rate across species and growing conditions. How is yield quality and economic return? Oh, there's there we go. How is yield quality economic return affected by nitrogen, and then what can help my N rate decisions on these crops? And those are the two projects that I'll be going through. The first is looking at Italian ryegrass forage, straight Italian ryegrass forage mix, and then some legume ryegrass mixtures as well. And the second, we'll be looking at some winter cereal forages and their response to nitrogen rate. So a quick project overview. If you've heard Kevin Jarek, who's on the call, or myself talk in the last few months, you may have seen, you may see some familiar slides. But the first project is something that Kevin is really the driving engine for up in Outagamie County, working with two specific producers and two different types of forage mixes. This is a little bit about the treatment design and project overview for 2022. This was done in 2021 as well. But essentially, we've got two different locations, and then two mixes at the site on the left, or the Seven Oaks Dairy site. Really, it's a straight nitrogen rate response study, looking at only the effects of nitrogen rate. Base fertility, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur was supplied where soil tests indicated. We have a fairly traditional or common tillage systems that you'd expect to see within this geography in Northeast Wisconsin. And you can see the crop history there up in the top row as well. baseline soil fertility levels were either at optimum or were fertilized to reach optimum. And then you can see on the bottom of the screen the specific mixes of the Italian rye and then the cocktail mix. And they were all drilled at 25 pounds per acre and randomized and replicated within the study design. In 2022, there were 3 cuttings a piece for each site. So we're going to get right into some results and figures here, and we'll move from dry matter yield and milk production per acre through some quality metrics and then some final summaries and wrap ups for the first project I'm summarizing. So we're looking at 3 figures here. As we move from left to right, you have the different sites and mixes. So you have the straight Italian rye on the left, the same site, but a cocktail mix in the center, and then a different site and a cocktail mix on the right. And that'll be fairly similar throughout the whole presentation, how that's designed and set up. Nitrogen rate on the x-axis, and on the y-axis on the left, we have dry matter yield. And on the right, as you can see on the label on the far right of your screen, we have milk production in terms of pounds of milk per acre. And that was estimated using the Milk 2016 spreadsheet. And you can see the prices that we use to determine the optimum response to nitrogen in terms of the nitrogen price, about 75 cents a pound of N for urea. This, because of the RFE and RFQ of all the forages within this study, it kind of fell into grade 1, and we used large squares, and we did $20 per hundredweight of milk. So we can see that if we look at these curves, we see increasing dry matter and milk production as we increase nitrogen rate. Not too surprising when we think of the composition of these mixes. We do see a little bit more of a plateau. If you can see my arrow or my cursor well, we essentially are able to reach a point, and these letters essentially signify if the treatments are statistically different from each other. So if you see the same letter, that would mean that statistically there's no difference between that dry matter yield or milk production. And looking across all 3 graphs, you can see that those either top 2 or top 3, maybe even top 4 treatments or N rates, if you look at the graph on the far right, we kind of reached a plateau where there wasn't any more statistical difference, maybe some numerical increases within these higher N rates. And when we kind of summarize these 2 responses, and we see the same trend for dry matter and milk production, which makes sense because the milk equation is driven by dry matter and energy, we have specific economic optimum nitrogen rates. And so those were determined by taking into consideration the agronomic optimum N, and then applying adjustments for the prices of the nitrogen fertilizer and selling hay or using that hay for milk production. And so you can see the EO&R ranges, or the red boxes on the figures here, identify the statistical range of an economic optimum N rate. So if I gave you one number, it would be right in the middle of those two values, or that red box. But there's a statistical range in optimum nitrogen rates. We have to be cognizant of that. Oops, apologize. And so essentially, when we're looking at those ranges, we go from left to right. There's also essentially for that median value, or that average value, we've got the corresponding yield and dry matter. So you can see we went from 4.12 to 3.84, 5.89 tons per acre as you move left to right. And then you can see the corresponding milk production values as well, based off of the milk equation. And so we certainly have some site variability, and then even some variability when we look at the types of mixes and composition of the forage stand. And again, this is dry matter across the entire growing season, so 3 cuts. So we've identified that we can identify and pinpoint an optimum N rate that we can use for dry matter and milk production. But the big questions that come up also is what happens in terms of protein and other quality metrics as well. So another big question that I hear thrown around a lot is, does protein always respond to more nitrogen? Does more nitrogen always lead to a higher protein content? And we have 3 different kind of answers here when we look at the three different site mixture combinations. So when we had that straight Italian rye or straight grass mixture of forages, we really didn't see much change until about 170 pounds of N. And then we saw a pretty stark increase in terms of that increase of protein content. And that kind of makes sense for a grass dominated forage mixture. When we had the mixture, the Seven Oaks mixture in the center here, we had no statistical difference between any of these treatments when you look at the range of crude protein that was measured. So the answer would be no, there wasn't a response to a protein that added nitrogen here. But when we get to the far right side, and I'll go into some more details about this composition of this stand compared to the other two, we did see kind of a more mixed bag, right? So our top three or highest N rates were all statistically similar, but then probably because of the dilution of a lower yielding crop in terms of dry matter, our zero rate was statistically the same as 215 pounds of N. So something to consider when just looking at protein response to nitrogen is that it certainly depends on the overall dry matter of feed and forage that you're producing. But your response to nitrogen, especially if you have a legume in the mix, may not be as predictable as we think. So if we look at, I'll go through a few different quality metrics. If we look at lignin percentage, something that shouldn't be really surprising that as we got to higher protein, higher dry matter, we'll look at the digestibility in a little bit here. We essentially reduced our lignin percentage, or lignin content did go down with increasing N rates. And then you can remember those optimum N rates are about 230 pounds on the left, about 10 pounds higher in the center, and then it was over around 260 to 280 pounds on the right. So you can see that we certainly at the lowest levels of lignin, that's where our optimum N rate was sitting at. For NDFD 30 or the 30 hour, and we look at this response to nitrogen, certainly a quality metric that we're concerned about in terms of fiber digestibility. We see that when we look at that response to nitrogen, we do see an impact as well. We see an increase up to that point where you kind of plateau and those treatments aren't very different from each other. So what I'm hoping this is kind of affirming is that once we can identify that optimum N rate, our quality starts to level off a little bit in terms of the statistics that we see here. Now, certainly these are increasing trends. We can't argue with the data showing that. But when we look at the numbers and the data behind it and the differences, we can kind of reach a plateau of where we're peaking in terms of our quality metrics. And that's a good sign, because that means when we identify an optimum N rate, there's value not just the yield standpoint, but also our expected quality as well. So another figure that kind of looks at that same structure, but we're looking at RFV and then milk per ton, milk per ton of dry matter that was harvested. So on the left, we have relative feed value for the y-axis, and on the right, sorry, it's kind of smushed together in the middle there. We have milk per ton of dry matter, right? Another metric, I was talking about milk per acre before. Now I'm talking about milk per ton of dry matter. And certainly we see a response to nitrogen rate in this regards as well. Just a reminder where the red boxes are those economic optimum nitrogen rate ranges for each site and mixture combination. And really the bullets in the bottom kind of summarize that RFV really didn't differ once we got above 130 pounds per acre of applied N, which was lower than most of the optimum N rate ranges. And the milk production per ton of dry matter really didn't differ between about 170 and 305 pounds of N. So at that point, really, if we're having the ability to increase dry matter, our quality is probably staying at least statistically consistent and from this data, and that's suggesting that. And so once we get to that economic optimum N rate or this recommended N rate from this data, we're sitting at a pretty good spot. And again, the RFV values kind of fit within that grade 1. Nothing peaked above 150 for this study. So if we look at another metric, again, this is the same information, but I think it's important, and I wanted to make sure that we got all this data out to communicate, because there was a lot of work that went into this study in terms of field and laboratory and analysis work. So when we look at just RFQ and N rate response, we can actually see that this kind of makes sense, right, where we see these peaks or essentially we see these plateaus in quality was about where the economic optimum N rate did really sit. One interesting thing that did happen on the far right on the mix that was a more legume dominated mix compared to the center one, we did see a higher value at that 160 pound end rate, or excuse me, 70 pound end rate. But really, when go back and think about the rate, balancing the tonnage and then quality aspects, we really kind of fit within that EONR. The cocktail mix peaked at this lower end rate on the far right figure, maybe driven by something I'll show in a little bit, where at those higher end rates, we probably saw a little bit more competitive rye within these mixtures that was out competing some of the legumes that were providing some of the feed value. But something important to consider. Now we've kind of gone through forage yield and quality aspects, and now something that is certainly important to note is kind of the sustainability of end use in these systems. What the data that you're looking at on the screen now shows are soil nitrate levels, and they're down to 3 feet soil nitrate levels, and it's shown in pounds of nitrate N per acre. And what the bars show are a pre-plant soil sample, so that open and white checkered or striped bar is showing the pre-plant soil N down to 3 feet. And the 3 consecutive red bars are showing post-harvest soil nitrogen down to 3 feet from 0, 170, and 305 pounds of applied N throughout the growing season. Again, split across the whole season. And this dotted line that you'll see across all 3 of these figures is kind of an assumed background mineralization for a lot of nitrogen budgeting and planning at 50 pounds. And so that's something to consider as well. But really what I think is important to show is that certainly when we're applying 305 pounds of N per acre, which was above what would be recommended from this data, we were quite high in terms of our residual soil nitrate within the system. But between 0 and 170 pounds of N, we really didn't see any statistical difference. And so I think I'm pretty comfortable with talking about these optimum N rates, and that these crops and these forages and these mixes are really using N pretty efficiently and not leaving a lot of residual N left over. And so that's a very promising outcome of the data here, because certainly in places where we're trying to work in some alternative forages, if they fit into your cropping system, we want to avoid residual nitrogen left over after the cropping season or forage harvest season. And I think this is showing that can be done. And there's really no difference between a zero N rate and 170 pounds of N within these systems. They're very good at foraging and scavenging nitrogen. The figure on the right is just kind of interesting to connect an economic optimum N rate and then that pre-plant soil N. And it really will describe what I go through in the next few slides as well, comparing 2 different years of this study. So the data that I've shown so far has just been from 2022. If you look at the data in 2021 and 2022, you can see the open circles versus the black dots or points on the figure on the far right. And just 6 points here. So this relationship is pretty simple, but I think it's a good story. And you can see that in the open circles in 2021, we started off very dry and had a lot of residual soil nitrate left from the previous year. So we were starting off with a lot of soil nitrogen in the upper 3 feet of the soil profile. And it's no surprise that in 2021, our economic optimum N rates across those forage systems were all within that kind of 155 to 175, 180 pounds of N per acre. When we look at 2022, it was a different growing season, especially because there were some early season challenges with saturated conditions and rainfall. We started off with quite a bit lower pre-plant soil nitrogen content in the upper 3 feet, and our optimum N rates were a lot higher this year. So this just goes to show you that even though we do maybe a response study in a given year, we really need to make sure we're tracking that across years and understanding these forages grown in a given year, what's the outcome. So I think a really good story to think about. I'm advancing here. There we go. I think this is a really cool slide. This is relating to the composition of the forage and with driving the nitrogen status of the system. And so without getting too complicated and really what this means is each figure again is looking at that site and mixture. And really, again, Italian ryegrass on the left, more of a what I would consider a low legume mixture in the center. And then on the right, it was noted that the mixture had a much higher legume content, or the legumes persisted quite a bit more strongly within this mixture as well on the right. And I think this really shows up when we relate the applied nitrogen rate to the nitrogen uptake for the entire growing season. So the dotted line in all these figures is a 1-to-1 relationship. That would mean for every pound of nitrogen applied, you took up one pound of nitrogen with the forage system. And what's interesting is at the point when these two lines intersect, so the black circles and points in fitted line is our actual data from the study. And really what happens is at 0N, for example, there was still about 50 pounds when 0N was applied, there was still about 50 pounds of N taken up by the forage crop. Makes sense. Our grasses are probably picking up some of that residual N that was left from previous crops or previous management, or it's just being mineralized out of the soil. But as we start to apply higher N rates, we get this switch where we're essentially applying more nitrogen than what we're taking up, or we're applying more into the system than is leaving the system. And again, this isn't saying that the crop isn't using everything. This is just relating what we're applying to what's being taken up. And that line crossed at about 150 pounds of N per acre, right? Now, if we think about N use efficiencies as a perfect 100% N use efficiency of fertilizer applied, would be close to that 1-to-1 line, but there's a black box of soil mineralization, so the data can get a little messy there. But think about where that line crosses. Now, when we go to a legume grass mixture, we see that line cross more towards about 190 to 200 pounds of applied N. And so what that's telling me is that until that point, we're still removing a lot more nitrogen than is being added to the system. And if you look down here, this makes sense in a legume grass mixture compared to what you see on the left, which is the grasses, that we are taking up about 100 pounds of nitrogen in this across the whole growing season when we're not even applying any. And so that relationship kind of makes sense compared to the left figure in the center. Now on the right, it's really interesting to note that this is a more high legume mixture where there's a higher percentage of legumes compared to the Italian ryegrass. And what we saw here was throughout the whole season, no matter what N rate you applied, we were always taking up more nitrogen than we applied. So we're always removing more out of the system than at least we were putting in with fertilizer. So this is really something important to think about in the sustainability and then just fertilizer economy space, is that if you're trying to manage a mixture to have a higher legume percentage, we need to take that into consideration when looking at nitrogen rates that are applied. Now, especially two different really growing conditions here, three different mixture growing condition combinations. But I really think this is an important study or a story when we're starting to compare nitrogen management. And if you want to keep a diverse mixture, you need to keep that into consideration, because certainly grasses can start to outcompete legumes within these mixes. And then just an important point to point out here, the y-axis is very different for the left two figures versus the right figure. And that just shows you how much nitrogen is moving through these systems. Now, what's old is new again. This is a research article from 1933, and it's a little blurry because I had to copy it and bring it over into PowerPoint, but this is looking at fertilized ryegrass and then mixture species compared to white clover, fertilized versus unfertilized, and you see the pounds of dry weight that respond when you fertilize this. So, what's old is new again. We're trying to dial in this management. Sometimes it's worth looking back into the literature. And this kind of agrees with what we just saw in terms of fertilization response. In a ryegrass mixture was quite a bit higher. You get a little bit less response within with the ryegrass, a little bit less response in the mixture, and then a white clover. You see a little bit response here. I guess that was part of I think there was a liming application here as well in this old study. But something to think about when we talk about recycling new ideas that are coming to light. So now I'll move to the second, we're going to quick summary slide of the information that I just shared with the first study. So when you look at the data from 2021 and 2022 that I've got in the table on the right here, I've got some kind of high points that I think are important. So we look at the conditions, right? So we had a more dry condition prior to planting, adequate precip. Last year, we had more saturated conditions prior to planting, and planting was delayed a little bit. We had differences in high versus low pre-plant soil nitrogen within the system. We had different cuttings because of the delayed schedule. This year, we did increase the amount of N rates that we applied, so that certainly is important as well. You can see that the optimum N rates kind of responded to the growing conditions that we would expect. Yields overall, in terms of tonnage, was about a similar range. Protein percent, comparable, I would say, in terms of those ranges. And then you kind of look at the return to nitrogen range that at each optimum N rate. Certainly when we have lower starting N in our systems and potentially lower mineralization rates, our response to N is going to be higher. And I think one thing that's really important is the last row here on this table is looking at harvest, what was the soil N, residual soil N, when you are at the optimum N rate. So if you're thinking about this in kind of a sustainability and water quality context, both of these ranges are fairly low compared to other crops that require nitrogen in Wisconsin cropping systems. So very, very promising to think about. And then the bullets on the left kind of summarize this as well. This is some really rigorous data that a lot of work was done to get these numbers. And I think it's nice to have some data-backed guidance for alternative forages coming out of this study. Okay, now I'll move to a quick 2 slides to overview some data from a winter cereal forages project. This was also done with many of the coordinators and collaborators that you see from UW Extension on the call today as well. And really the objective of this was to evaluate nitrogen need for either triticale or cereal rye in kind of a fall seeded winter cereal forage system where there was dairy manure applied. And so really it was a similar nitrogen rate response study. Soil N was taken as well, forage yield and quality measured, and there are 7 sites across Wisconsin in 2022, and there are ongoing continuing sites this year in 2023. And I'll just show a quick few figures. I know that I'm slammed a lot of graphs into one presentation, and specifically one slide here. And I've got the county labels on there just to show the variability that we really saw within the winter cereals and their response to nitrogen. And I think Colby Grint is on the call. Definitely want to acknowledge all the work Colby did with NRCS now, previously with NPM, helped putting this data together as well. And so when we look across the specific counties in the data we see here, we really only saw a statistical response to nitrogen at 2 of the 7 sites. And again, this isn't really surprising when we go look at some of the information I'll show on the next slide. But in a system where we're trying to fit in a winter cereal to provide some fall and winter cover in terms of conservation benefits, also provide some forage matter that can be used within whatever system you're kind of wanting to fit that into. We see the opportunity for nitrogen to possibly pay or not pay off in these cases. And really in 2 of these cases, we saw a statistical nitrogen response. One of the optimum N rates, agronomic optimum N rates, this isn't taking price into consideration, was 96 pounds per acre at the Marathon County site. And at one of the Outagamie County sites, there was a response to about 135 pounds of N per acre. And that was a site where we were starting off with quite a bit lower residual nitrogen within the system. And so this kind of makes sense when we think about the variability across the state and the challenges that we have to deal with. Now, important to remember that certainly we're seeing manure applied before the planting of these winter cereals. And so if we're able to capture those credits, not only from the soil, but then the manure as well, potentially we can grow these winter cereals with a fairly low nitrogen input or investment. And when we move to the next figure, this is taking all of those sites and putting them in one graph showing 2 different things. We're relating the optimum agronomic optimum N rate on the y-axis on the left with for the figure on the left 3 foot deep pre-plant soil nitrogen levels, right? So these are the pounds per acre of N that we would have expected with again, there's probably a contribution from manure here, but then also some mineralization that's occurred throughout the end of the summer. But we saw this relationship that is fairly common throughout a lot of pre-plant relationships of studies that relate pre-plant nitrogen levels to an optimum N rate. As soil N starting within our growing season increased, we saw a reduction in the optimum N rate. And around, really, when you look at these points down here that were 0, where we didn't have any statistical response to nitrogen, 100 pounds or greater, we really weren't expecting much of an end response. And that kind of fits with some work that Larry Bundy and then Kerry Lobotsky had looked at in wheat and nitrogen response as well. Now, when we look at a soil sample that was taken in the spring, only in the top 12 inches or top foot on the figure on the right, and this is in parts per million, not pounds per acre, but we kind of see that similar relationship. It's a little steeper, a little harder to interpret, but certainly when we get to lower amounts of spring N that's available, we probably have a higher requirement or demand for winter cereal. So these relationships hold true, and I think this is important because then we potentially can have a little bit more guidance and management. If we're kind of seeing some of these alternative forages as not really management intensive parts in your operation, a few soil samples to determine the available N could save you quite a bit of nitrogen fertilizer investment, especially if you have high enough levels or recent manure applications. Now, one thing I will show really quickly is the crude protein and then RFQ response to nitrogen at all these sites. And certainly we can see, if you look at the black circles, you do see a response of crude protein to nitrogen. And that kind of fits in what we'd seen at the previous slide. But we have to remember our growth is really limited within late fall, early spring within these winter cereals. And then the RFQ response to nitrogen at this point is kind of similar to the dry matter. It's a little more mixed. In a few sites, we did see kind of a linear response. This first Outagami site, there was kind of starting out with a lower N status in the system, but just kind of some mixed results that we need to go through a little bit more. Site variability is really critical within predicting a nitrogen demand. So summarizing this work, there's kind of a combination of high pre-plant soil N and higher manure rates can really allow for pretty relatively low or little applied N to produce 2 to 3 tons per acre of dry matter in some of these site cases. The yield and quality is certainly variable, and it's going to be affected by farm and site characteristics. But this may be an avenue for moderate quality forage that can provide some conservation benefits and cover throughout the fall and early spring. So with that, sorry I ran a little bit over time here. Just wanted to give a quick thank you to all the collaborators in the Italian rye and cocktail mix study that you see on the screen here. And won't go through and read everyone, but certainly I know we all really appreciate the work. This is really valuable work that Wisconsin really needs. Thank you to all those involved in the Winter Cereals Project. And I can answer any questions now, or certainly there's my email address. Please feel free to shoot me a message anytime.
Yeah, thank you, John. I think we might have time for one question here from the chat. So for practical purposes, how can farmers predict what the EONR will be for each farm, field crop, species from year to year?
Yep. So big questions. Thanks, Brian. So I think the best way to predict this is, and the best way we have right now is we can look at the data that we have from our past year's response. And that's how most states determine nitrogen recommendations is you look at the averages of the past year's response, but then you can take measurements like a pre-plant soil nitrogen test, making sure you're picking up any nitrogen credits that you have. Those can really determine what's going on in the coming growing season. So making sure we pick all those data points up to guide you is probably the most in-year variability that you can catch. And I think that especially with these grass crops and forage crops that really grow pretty darn quickly and then can scavenge in pretty well, I would err on making sure that you're accounting for that and not trying to overinvest in nitrogen if it's not needed. But certainly on the Italian rye mixtures that we saw, there's a decent amount of nitrogen that's needed for those crops. And so hitting that middle point where tonnage is economically valuable, but then we're still having a certain quality component is really important.
Great. Thank you, John. For the sake of time, we'll probably move forward to the next presentation. But again, thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us today. And Jason can start pulling up his slides. So for our last presenter, I would like to introduce Jason Cavadini. Jason is the Grazing Outreach Specialist with UW-Madison's Division of Extension. who will be presenting pasture renovation and frost seeding. Jason, whenever you're ready.
All right, sorry about that. I was having some technical difficulties. Can you see my cover slide there?
Yes.
All right, thank you. So I will try my best to respect everyone's time here and not go long. So I'll tell you that I am going to move a little bit quick through the slides here, but I will be able to stay longer if anyone has questions at the end, or if you want to contact me later, that would be fine as well. So today I'm going to be talking about renovating pasture. So Bill started out talking about how cool season perennial pastures are really the most cost-effective way of feeding animals on pasture. And so a really important part of that is how can we maintain a highly productive, high quality pasture. And even though it doesn't really look like it outside, we're really at the time of the year when we need to be starting to make plans for that, whether it's what kind of renovating we're going to be doing or purchasing seed. So I often get questions related to renovating pastures, really focused on how can we get more forage, how can we get better grass, how can we extend the grazing season longer and keep animals on pasture longer. And often those questions turn to solutions that require some kind of investment, like what seed should I buy? When should I interseed clover? How much fertilizer should I apply? Should I replant my pasture? And I usually respond to those questions with more questions. Have you soil sampled? What kind of grass do you have in your pasture? How many acres do you have and how many head do you have on those acres? Often we'll find that people are setting themselves up for failure from the start by having too many head on too few of acres. And so really what it gets down to is, what is your management? And this is really a question that should be asked before we come up with any kind of plan for how to maintain pastures and what the best renovating approach is for pastures. So if we're talking about grazing, generally we're going to be talking about a best management practice for grazing is what we refer to as managed grazing, which could be defined as the following properties: leaving 4 to 6 inches of residual post grazing, grazing on something like a 30 to 40 day rotation, maintaining a grass and legume mix, which really becomes critical in our fertility management, but also has a pretty heavy impact on the quality of the forage as well. What we do as far as cutting and clipping, that definitely has an impact on the quality and persistence of our forage, but also has implications for what renovation approach we decide to go with. Short duration grazing, but high stocking density. So basically a lot of heavy impact, a lot of animals on a small spot for a very short amount of time and then moving them on. A low stocking rate, which should not be confused with stocking density. So while stocking density is how many animals are on a particular piece of ground at a given time, stocking rate is how many animals are on an entire farm. Extended season grazing, so that would be a goal of all of these other properties of managed grazing, and then outwintering on pasture. And so the reason that is in there is because it influences, or it's part of that goal of keeping animals on pasture as much as possible, but it also influences how we determine or what approach we take to renovating pasture. So when we talk about renovating pastures, where there's basically 4 scenarios that would lead to that. So one of them would be post outwintering or any damaged pasture. So something that was grazed during excessive moisture that got tore up from grazing. A mismanaged or overgrazed pasture. So oftentimes when I receive questions from farmers on how to repair pasture, how to renovate it or improve the quality of it, what got them to the point was maybe not implementing all of those properties on the previous slide. Poor quality forage base. So sometimes people just start out with poor quality forage in the first place, and they want to renovate it to a better quality forage. And then just thinning stands. So the picture left here is an example of a pasture that was managed with all of those properties on the previous slide. But the fact is over time, clover thins out no matter how we manage it. And you can see exactly where the clover remains in the stand, and where it doesn't remain, we see nitrogen shortage. So this would be a pretty textbook example of pasture that is in need of renovating clover. So when we look at different renovation methods, there's really like 4 main methods. There's lots of different, variations on these, but really we're talking about frost seeding or no-till drilling or drilling into a prepared seed bed, or the option of broadcasting on the open ground, which definitely takes some different management. But if we look at the timing of when we want to renovate, each of these are better suited for a different timing of planting. So like we're coming up now on frost seeding timing. No-till drilling pastures usually happens about a month after frost seeding. And then drilling into a prepared seed bed happens when most other crops are being planted around the state as well. So there are some factors that influence what approach we end up going with. So the first question is, what is the target composition of the pasture? Do we want to have legumes in the pasture? There are some farmers who prefer to not use legumes for quality reasons, but for the most part, farmers are trying to maintain a legume component in their pastures. Whether or not hay is being made is a big factor, not only for fertility, but because when it comes to trying to figure out what renovation method is going to work on our farm, it really boils down to competition. Almost all of these methods work if we're able to manage competition of the existing stand. And so that is one place where haymaking comes in. Our rotation length and stocking rate plays a role. What is the current composition? I'll go into that on the next slide, why that's important. It has to do with how much open space there is. And then fall grazing and residual really plays a role in setting up pastures for renovating, but also soil test information and soil type. So there's some renovation methods that just won't work in sandy soil, for example. So when it comes to making decision on what renovation method to go with, I've broken it down into like 5 different categories. So we'll start with like an outwintered or damaged pasture. So this photo here is an example of an outwintered pasture that was reseeded in the spring. This was the outwintered pasture the previous spring. This was never reseeded. This spring was not a late spring with excessive moisture, so the perennial came back through fairly well. This spring here was last spring, where it was very wet for a very long time, and it looked like the pastures were plowed afterwards, so they needed to be renovated. But the goal with an outwintered or damaged pasture is to return to a quality pasture. really that determination is going to be made each spring because each spring is different. But the options for doing that would be to broadcast grass or clover, or to no-till drill grass and clover onto that open ground. But like I said, it may not be necessary every year. If you've got a good quality grass pasture with thinning legumes, like the photo I showed earlier, the goal would be to fill in or maintain legumes. In that case, you would want to perhaps graze down that area late in the fall, like even in the dormant season, get it down a little lower than you normally would, maybe between 2 and 4 inches. And then your options would be to frost seed that in the spring, or to no-till drill in the spring. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, there'd be about a month difference. So that's one reason why we sometimes see an advantage with frost seeding, is just because we're simply getting out before competition about a month ahead of time. So clover almost always works in that scenario. Grasses, there are recommendations out there. I'll show you some work from our university that has done frost seeding with grasses before, but it's not as high of a success rate as clover. So grasses are something to just understand that if you do make that investment on the seed, it's not going to be as high of a success rate as clover. So it's just a risk worth knowing about. If you've got a good quality grass pasture, but it's thin, so you've got a thinning grass and legume stand, and your goal is to just thicken that with grass and legumes, again, you can prep that spot by grazing in late fall. And then your options would be to no-till drill the grass clover mix the next spring. But it's important to know that there must be some bare spots for this to work. If it's a thick stand, it's going to be tough to make that work with the no-till drill. One thing that I always try to point out is you want to use grasses with similar palatability. So an example of this is if a farmer has an orchard grass pasture of a orchard grass variety that matures very quickly in the spring, oftentimes they want to try to replace that with something that doesn't mature as quickly, or something like meadow fescue that is just a better quality grass. That is not a recommendation, however, because there's too much of a difference in palatability between those two grasses. So what's going to happen is you'll get that meadow fescue to start to establish, but the livestock will preferentially graze that and just thin it out within a year or two. And so it ends up being a waste of money. So if you're going to use this method, it is a good idea to try to match something in the similar ballpark as far as quality and palatability. If you've got a poor quality pasture with patchy grass, and the goal is to transition the pasture to quality grass legume mix, you would graze tight in the fall. And by tight, I mean on borderline or even overgrazing it, like more than what we would recommend. The reason for that is the overgrazing will set that poor quality grass back a little bit and help you out with competition. In that case, you could frost seed clover the next spring, or no-till drill grass clover mix. It might need to be done a couple times in a row, a couple springs in a row, before you're able to fully transition it to the composition that you're looking for. But again, there needs to be exposed ground for this to work. Something like less than 50% density. If there's more than 50% density, now we're looking at a poor quality, like a thick sod type of grass. The goal would be to replace the poor grass with a quality grass legume stand. But in this case, we're really going to be looking at like a complete renovation. In this case, we're talking grasses like brome grass or bluegrass or reed canary or quackgrass. It's really going to be hard to renovate something like that, or to transition that pasture over to a better quality without almost starting over. And in that case, the best approach is to terminate somehow, whether it's tilling or spraying, and no-till drill after that. So I mentioned good quality grasses a lot. So what constitutes as a good grass? Well, this could be a whole conversation, and it could be argued because everyone has their favorite grass. My only goal with showing this is just to show how well grasses can do if managed properly or if managed well. And so these are just some different grass. Here we have some grass blends, so different species of grasses. Here we have grass legume mixes, and we're pushing 5 tons of dry matter per acre. This is just from last year, and I'll admit last year was a little bit of a down year. We've seen better yields than this, I would say, on average. But with 4 harvests, this was what our grasses can achieve if managed well. There are some advanced renovation methods. So these would be like not recommended unless the farmer is really showing really high attention to detail and really good management. So one method, this is kind of a made up term, but frost drilling. So basically around frost seeding time using a drill. The advantage is it's improved uniformity over broadcasting. We really can dial in the rate and really avoid having skips and overlaps and stuff like that. And we do get better seed to soil contact with this method. So like with this, you would be shooting for getting out there in the morning during the freeze thaw cycle and running for a couple hours until the soil starts to get soft. Probably won't work every single year, but we have seen this be successful, and there are quite a few farmers using this. Another good tool for doing this is a brilliant seeder. Late summer interseeding. So we're looking at like August 15th to September 15th time frame. In this case, you'd graze before seeding, and then use a no-till drill to drill grass legume mix into an existing stand. And then you would graze that site until you see plants emerge, and then you'd remove the animals. There are some farmers, I get asked a lot about complete renovation without termination. It's not my top recommendation, but if there's a farmer who I know is really on top of his or her game with management, it can be done. So you would have to graze tight late in the season, no-till drill during the dormant season, and then again repeat if necessary. So for seeding rates, this is a tough one. There's a lot of information out there. So what I tried to do is on the right is a table that was published by UW Extension years ago from work done in Wisconsin. This was for frost seeding. On the left is a balance using the NRCS recommendations for pasture renovation. So for full pasture establishment, we're looking at around 60 seeds per square foot for planting, with a goal of about 20 seeds per square foot becoming established plants. And if it's a grass clover mix, it'd be about a 50-50 mix. For renovation, we're looking at 30 seeds per square foot of legumes. On this table here, there are a lot of grasses listed here for frost seeding. These have showed success before. This is proof of that, but I just think it's important for farmers to know that any grass for frost seeding, the success rate is going to be lower than clover. So it's just important to know that before the farmer spends money on seed. This is from some frost seeding work that we conducted at the Marshfield Research Station, looking at different methods. So like I mentioned earlier, frost seeding occurred about a month prior to other methods of interseeding clover into an established stand. So we have frost seeding here, we have no-till drilling, and then a tine seeder. This photo here is of the Einbach tine seeder, which is basically just scratching the surface of the soil. It looks like it on here, but it's not tillage. It's just scratching with teeth and moving some mulch out of the way and blowing seed onto the soil surface. And here's how many plants became established per square foot. So we can see that we had the highest success rate with red clover. What's interesting is if you look in this photo here, you can see a line to the right is where we frost seeded, and you can definitely see the effects of more clover. There's more nitrogen, and you'll see on the next slide the data that show that. But basically, 5 pounds per acre of clover is about 32 seeds per square foot. At best, about 33% of the seeds that were delivered to the soil became an established plant. Legumes complement grasses, and that's why we do this. We also do it for forage quality, but here is the crude protein levels. So what we did is we went out to the pasture and we collected biomass samples, and we separated the grass from the clover. We were at 15% protein, where we just had pure grass. This was in August. And then we were pushing 20%, where we had legumes in the mix. And so we had about 30% more nitrogen in the forage where there were legumes, which contributed to a better forage quality, 35% higher RFQ where legumes were in the pasture. It's just important to understand the link between nitrogen and potassium and legumes. And the reason why I mention this is because we can go through all the effort of trying to get legumes back into pasture. But if the reason we want that there is for nitrogen, like I showed on the previous slide. But if we don't pay attention to our soil tests and watch our potassium levels, then we don't have an environment for the legumes to thrive. So if the potassium isn't in the soil, it's not really worth spending the money on the clover. And so that's why this relationship is really important. So if you look at our university guidelines, the recommendation is 130 pounds per acre for pure grass across the season and split applications. But where we have grass legume mix, no nitrogen is required. But for potassium, it's critical for legume persistence. If we're making hay on the land, we're removing about 150 pounds per acre from about a 3-ton crop of hay. If we're not making hay and we're only grazing, we're still removing about 30 pounds per acre of potassium in a given year. So it is something that we have to pay attention to. So the whole reason why I include this slide here is, like I said earlier, we have to be mindful of our potassium levels if we're trying to maintain clover in our stand. So a soil fertility strategy for a managed grazing system, with potassium, is to manage potassium to manage nitrogen. So if we don't have potassium, we don't have the legumes. If we don't have the legumes, we don't have nitrogen. If we don't have nitrogen, then our grass yields will suffer. So like I said, if you make hay, then you have to consider replacing potassium at the removal rate. If you don't make hay, you should replace it occasionally still. But then interseeding clover on about a third of the acres each year will really help with our nitrogen management program, but we really need to make sure that potassium is there. So I know that was very quick, and there may be some questions I'd be happy to answer or clarify something that I maybe moved too quickly with.
Thank you, Jason. Looks like we do have a couple of questions that came up in the chat. While you're answering those, be sure to fill out just the quick evaluation poll that's getting sent out to you now. So first from Dale, we have pasture has open ground between drill rows of grass. What are your thoughts on type of seed to broadcast immediately before animals enter paddock? To use hoof action to improve seed soil contact. Use summer annuals, perennials, or forage oats.
So the first question of drill rows, it's going to go back to what those drill rows consist of. If it's very quick growing, very aggressive grass, then it's just going to be tough to get something established between drill rows. That's not a lot of space. and I just from experience, you'll see drill rows for a period of time in the spring as things green up, but not for a very long time, and then they disappear, and I'm not sure if there's enough time to get something established. So it's really going to depend on what kind of grass is there and how aggressive that grass is. You could do things like clipping. In that frost eating trial that I showed the data from, we did clipping, and we also did flash grazing to see if those would help with establishment. We did not see any significant effects from that. So it's just an established grass pasture is just a really competitive environment, and it's tough to stay ahead of when you're trying to get something established. So sometimes it does mean you have to do something to set it back.
I'll pause here for a second just to share a quick announcement, and that notify you that the CCA QR code should be up on the screen now. And also that we will have another Focus on Forage event on March 15th at 12:30. And you can register on the same website that you registered for this event. That might conclude kind of our formal time here now that it's 2 p.m. I noticed that there's a couple more questions in the chat. And so I might have Jason, if you're available, maybe you can continue just to answer those. And then if you're unable to scan that code, also just please enter your CCA